Welcome back to Train Signal Citrix XenApp training. You're watching Troubleshooting XenApp 6 lesson. Oh, you guys have to be very excited considering this is sort of the last technical session or technical lesson in this course. Now, by now, you guys should literally have become Zen masters, or at least I would hope. Otherwise, I'm going to be very disappointed. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to cover are the 7 categories of Troubleshooting XenApp 6. And these categories I've taken directly out of the XenApp 6 prep guide for the CCA exam. And while most of this content we've already covered, I just want to focus back on this just first of all so that you're a little more prepared for the exam. And I'm covering these particular troubleshooting categories. I just don't want these to catch anyone by surprise. And it would be a sort of like a nice walkthrough or a recap of the troubleshooting, the main features, the main factors of the troubleshooting stuff for XenApp 6 so that you're comfortable with it. So it's going to be a relatively short lesson. I'll show you some things and some other things. It's probably, you've seen it 100 times already. I don't want to have to be necessarily repetitive. So the 7 categories or the 7 classes of troubleshooting XenApp 6 can be classified as follows. Determine how to troubleshoot IMA given a scenario, and this is word for word from the prep guide, by the way. Determine how to troubleshoot load manager, so we're going to talk about that. License issues, how to troubleshoot session states, how can they negatively affect XenApp implementations or servers, etc. How to use the qfarm/load command. We talked about that as well, but we'll reiterate here, recap. How to troubleshoot web interface issues, how to troubleshoot printing issues. So let's go through and recap all of these categories real quick. Alright, so let's start off with troubleshooting IMA. So the IMA service has to be functioning on the XenApp server in order for that server to properly communicate with the data store and to communicate with the data collector, etc. Now, the first thing you want to check is obviously, is the IMA service running? If the IMA service is not running, then, well, that's your problem, and you'll have to check to see why that IMA service is running. One of the common reasons why IMA service stops running is the user that you originally configured that DSN with, that ODBC connection to connect to the database. Maybe that's changed. Maybe the password on that user has changed. Maybe it's a combination. I've seen it where the user has changed, the user account's changed, and the password's changed, or vice versa. So you can use the dsmain or /config command to choose or to reinitiate that connection, either using the same username or user account with a different password, or a completely different user account and different password. The other thing to check is the XML service running and is the XTE service running. Now, as you know, the XTE service will only run if session reliability is turned on within the farm. So if that's turned on, then the XTE service should be running on your XenApp server. If that's not, that could be possibly affecting IMA service. The other reason for IMA service not starting could be the zone architecture. Maybe that's not ideal. Maybe there's way too much communication between the different servers, which is causing that IMA service to not run or to not function properly. The IMA service will also fail to start if there is any kind of corruption at the data store database level. So one of the things you want to check right away is the dscheck command, and if necessary with the /clean. You might need to recreate the local host cache. So there's a number of things that I want you to take a look at, especially within the dsmain command, if your IMA service isn't starting. So that's as far as the IMA service is concerned. Now, with regards to load manager, well, we've talked a lot about qfarm/load, and I'm going to show you a slide in a second here that reiterates what we've been talking about. But anytime there's anything to do with load, the first thing you want to do is run the qfarm/load. That will give you a good idea of where to start. Maybe you're having a license issue. Maybe you're having an edition mismatch issue. Maybe the service or the server isn't accepting any more users because it thinks that it's at full load even though there's nobody logged on to that server. I've seen that happen. So use the qfarm/load immediately anytime you suspect load management type issues. Now, the other thing to be aware of, the load evaluators. Which load evaluator are you using? Are you using the default one, which is based on server user load? Are you using the advanced one? Are those the default ones that you're using? Are you using a custom load evaluator? And if you are using a custom load evaluator, have you configured the load throttling rule within that particular load evaluator? I've noticed that a lot of customers, when they go to create load evaluators or custom load evaluators, ignore or don't configure the load throttling rule, simply because the name is confusing or they don't understand what it does exactly, so they ignore it. Again, load throttling, and you'll notice that both the default and the advanced default load evaluators have load throttling enabled. And the reason for that is that load throttling will pace the amount of concurrent users that are logging on to the server at the same time. As we've been discussing throughout the series, the most intensive part, the most resource intensive part of a task is the log on process. The log on process will typically consume a lot of CPU, a lot of memory, until that user actually is connected and logged on to that particular XenApp server. So if you don't have load throttling configured as a rule and multiple users are logging on at the same time and it's not being paced where it's connecting a user completely and then taking another user, etc., if that's happening, that could be negatively impacting the load. So make sure you take a look at that as well. How to troubleshoot licensing issues. Licensing issues are always fun. They are always fun within XenApp, because the messages, the event viewer errors that you get aren't self-explanatory enough. So when it comes to licensing, number one thing I want you to check the license file and the license server. Make sure your license server is able to read the license file and all of your licenses are there. Make sure you are not going over the limit as far as licensing is concerned. So if you have 1,000 users connected but you have only 800 licenses, make sure you're not breaking that threshold. Make sure you have the correct amount of remote desktop services licenses as well. Make sure you're not going over the limit as far as that's concerned either. So those are two things I want you to take a look at right away. Make sure the license server services are started on your XenApp server. There's two of them. Make sure those are both started, and I'll show you in a second where to check for those, but those are important. Make sure those are started. If you've changed the default ports for licenses, or for the license server and the license management console, make sure when you're connecting, you're using the right ports. So if you're not using 27,000 as the default license port and you're not using 8082 for the license management console, make sure you're addressing the right ports that you've configured. Make sure that the policy is properly configured to point to the right license server, and make sure that you can resolve the license server name if you have configured the policy to connect to the hosting. I've seen that as well, where the name resolution doesn't work. The name of the server is correct, but the XenApp server can't resolve it. As a result, it doesn't see the licenses. So make sure you see that properly within your policy as well. Session states can negatively affect XenApp servers as well. So a lot of us don't use session reliability. But if you're using session reliability, make sure you've configured it in all the right places. If you've configured it on your XenApp farm, if you've configured it under web interface, if you've configured it in the access gateway. So make sure session reliability is turned on wherever it needs to be turned on for those connections to be made over session reliability between all the different components within the Citrix farm. If session reliability is turned on, make sure that the XTE service is starting properly on all the XenApp servers within your farm. That's going to be very important. Additionally, whenever it comes to sessions and states and firewalls and ports and networking, telnet is a very generic network command and tool that I'm sure you're well aware of how to use. But telnet can come in handy when you're trying to troubleshoot whether or not particular ports are open within your farm, right? So if you do telnet, space the server, space the port, and you hit enter, technically the screen should go black. If the screen goes black, that means you're able to communicate across that port, and that port's open, and that port's okay. If it throws an error, then that port is not okay. Well, that's your problem, or you can start looking there at least. So it gives you an idea, it gives you a very, very good idea of where to start looking when firewalls and ports are, when they come into the mess or the issue. Users are not able to enumerate applications, or they're able to enumerate application. They click on an application. Sometimes the application launches. Other times the application doesn't launch. Well, if sometimes the application is launching, other times it's not, immediately look at the XML servers that are configured. And I'm going to show you in a second where you can go to take a look under web interface, for example, to make sure that all the XML servers that are configured there are properly functioning, they're responding properly. A lot of times you'll see that the servers that are in that list, don't respond properly or the XML service isn't starting. As a result, because there's more than one of them in that list, when users click, sometimes the application launches, other times the application doesn't launch, because that other time when the application isn't launching, it's using the XML server or the XML server that's configured, but the service on it isn't working properly. So that's very important. Take a look at that as well. Name resolution is the mother of all causes. So at all times, make sure your DNS and, if you need to, your host file locally are properly configured in order to make sure that you're not having any kind of naming resolution issues within the farm. If you need to verify connectivity to a particular server, use MSTSC, or basically the RDP client, to connect to that server. If you are able to get RDP connectivity to that server, well, then that resolves the issue of the RDP connection. Maybe the ICA listener isn't working properly, and I've shown you how to use the ICA configuration or the ICA listener configuration tool to verify that as well. So MSTSC is a very handy tool because it immediately tells you if there's connectivity to that server or not. You should also check that the ICA listener ports are there, that you have enough ICA listener ports. And if you have enough ICA listener ports, is the state of those listener ports in listening? Is it listening, or is it in disconnected? Is it disabled? Is it not active? You should take a look at the state of the listener ports to make sure that those are ready to accept sessions, because that could also be part of your problem. All right, we've been talking about qfarm/load. Now, qfarm/load, again, is a very handy tool whenever troubleshooting. Start with that right away. And we've talked about the different values and what they mean. Anything from 0 to 9998 is normal, though that's a normal value. Anything with a 59, for example, means that there are no load evaluators configured. That would point you in that direction. A 10,000 value would mean that the server is at 100% load, is no longer going to accept any new connections. A 20,000 value means that the XenApp server has a misconfigured addition that doesn't match what it's seeing in the license file. 4 nines and a 0 means that custom administrator, custom farm administrator is trying to log on and use some of these qfarm commands, and he or she doesn't have access to do so. So the qfarm load immediately gives you visibility into some of the issues that you're seeing, or that you could potentially be the cause of the issue that you're seeing. Make sure you memorize these values and what they mean for the CCA exam. That's going to be very important. Web interface. Web interface is always fun to troubleshoot, right? Have you verified that the XML servers that are listed in your web interface are all properly functioning? The XML service is properly functioning. I'll show you how to do that in a second as well. Have you verified authentication? Is the authentication method that you've configured the right one? You know, using explicit pass-through. Is that properly configured? Are all the ports properly configured and open between the server and web interface, between the clients and the XenApp servers, between the client and web interface, etc., etc.? Port 80 needs to be open. 443 needs to be open. 1494 needs to be open between the client and the XenApp servers. 2598 needs to be open between, again, the clients and the XenApp servers if you're using session reliability. So make sure you pay attention to all these ports that have to be available in order for that connection to be properly configured. Is the web interface pointing to more than one XenApp farm? And if it is, are all the XML servers in the list in all the farms properly configured? Now, that's the same thing as the first bullet point, except in the first bullet point, I'm assuming you only have one farm. Just in case you have multiple farms, just make sure that XML server in all the farms is properly configured. Are you properly configured for Access Gateway? Are you configuring the policy within the web interface to point to a gateway direct? Are you in contact with your network administrator and you guys understand how this is configured so that you're configuring from a web interface perspective properly? Now, one of the most common issues I always hear about with web interface is, well, we can't get the auto client detection to work properly. It's pointing to the Citrix website for the users to download the clients. How do I make it point locally to my web interface server? And the reason this happens is during the installation of web interface, it will ask you if you want to install the clients. If you chose to skip the installation of the clients during the installation of web interface, the auto detection process won't work. Now, let's go ahead and switch over to our server, and let me show you how you can configure the auto client detection if you didn't do it during the installation of web interface. Alright, so as you know, my XenApp server, my XA01 server, is also my web interface server. And in order for us to double check that everything is properly configured for the auto client detection to work properly when users visit the website, we have to take a look at the web interface configuration, or we have to take a look at where web interface is installed. So before that, let me illustrate the problem and then show you how to fix it. We're going to go ahead and minimize this. And let's say this was a user at a workstation that doesn't have the Citrix online or offline plugin or any kind of plugin configured, and they want to be able to access resources from your web interface site. So the first thing they're going to do, obviously, is they're going to visit that web interface site. Now, remember, they don't have a local client installed here, so they're going to go ahead and log in. Now, the first thing you'll see here is that the web interface has already auto-detected that you don't have a client installed locally and is prompting you to install a client. Now, the problem is if I click on download here, what it's doing is it's redirecting me to the Citrix website to download a client. Now, this can be annoying. I don't really want to do this. I want to exit out of here. Let's see if I can go back. And I want this to prompt me to install a client directly from my web interface server. Now, to do that, during the installation of web interface, if you chose to skip past the uploading of the Citrix clients to the web interface, this is what's causing it. Now, in order to fix the problem, you either want to download the ICA clients or the XenApp online plugin and offline plugin, all the plugins from the Citrix website. Or if you have access to the XenApp 6 ISO or CD, you can also find them on there. Now, depending on when you're installing and when you're configuring this, those plugins might be old, so you probably want to visit the Citrix website, download the newer ones. But for us to illustrate here, and just for the purposes of the demonstration, if you open your actual XenApp 6 CD, and if you click on under Citrix Receiver and Plugins, you'll see that I have all of my plugins. Now, on the web interface server, what I want to do is I want to navigate to the C drive and navigate to where I installed my web interface server. Typically, it's under Program Files x86. It's going to be under Citrix, and it's going to be under Web Interface. Once you've double-clicked on that, which version of the web interface, I'm using 5.3.0. Once you're in there, you're going to see that there's a folder called Clients. Now, if the folder is empty, that is why web interface is redirecting users to the Citrix website. It doesn't have any clients installed on it. As a result, it's going to say, well, I don't have any clients, but this user needs clients, so I'm going to point them to the Citrix website. What you want to do here is you want to copy the Windows folder if you just want to offer Windows support for your web interface users. You can copy the Windows folder here. Now let's see what happens if I go back to my web interface server and I click on refresh. As soon as I hit refresh, you'll see that now it changed. Now if I click, I'm accepting the terms or whatever, and I click on download, bada bing, it's prompting me to install the client automatically from the web interface server. If I click on run, it's going to go through and install the client for me. Now, one more thing I want to mention here is if you want to extend support for more than just Windows, well, then you want to grab the Mac folder here, and you want to grab the Linux folder here, and you want to grab the Java folder, etc., etc. Make sure you copy all these folders down to the web interface server here so that when your users are connecting from different endpoints, the web interface is able to detect which endpoint they're connecting from and offer them the plugin that makes the most sense. Because if any of these are missing, if someone's coming in through a Mac and it can't detect it, then it's going to point them to the Citrix website. So I just wanted to make you aware of this. This is a common issue that I get asked about a lot and that I see a lot of issues, so I just wanted to point it out. Now, while we're in here, let's take a look at the web interface configuration so I can show you where the XML servers are configured so that if you're having any kind of an issue, you can start by looking there. So under Citrix Management Consoles, if we go to the Citrix Web Interface Management Console here, and under the XenApp websites or even the XenApp services site, if you right-click your site, go to Server Farms. First of all, make sure that you have, if you have more than one farm, then you want to check the XML service on every one of those farms. Right now, I only have XA01 configured, but if you double-click, you want to make sure that all the XML servers that are in this list have the XML service properly started on them. Because if there are any servers in this list with the XML service that isn't starting or having issues starting, then you're going to experience the effect where users are clicking on applications and they're launching sometimes, where they're not launching other times, or the applications aren't enumerating properly. So you want to make sure if there's any server that's causing this problem, you want to take it out. And one of the troubleshooting methods by which you can determine if a server is causing this issue is if you're suspecting XA01 and you have 5 or 6 other servers here. Well, after hours or whenever you can, remove all the other servers from this list, keep the one that's problematic, and try to launch applications. If you're incapable of launching applications, then this server is having an issue. Take it out of the list, add all the other ones, and keep going. This will give you a quick process of elimination onto which server is causing the problem, and as a result, you can log onto that server, take it out of the farm, and run any kind of maintenance that you need against it. Now, keep in mind, you're taking a look at it here, but also, depending on how the user is connecting, if the user is connecting via the agent that's installed locally as well, and I showed you the plugin where you can right-click on it. So you want anything that's using the services site here, maybe they're coming in through iPads, you want to make sure that the XML service on here is properly configured as well. Now keep in mind, if you are using Secure Gateway or Access Gateway and you have it configured down here, then you want to take a look at the XML servers that are configured here as well. So let's say I have it configured for Gateway Direct, right? So if I select Gateway Direct and click on Next here and click one more time, you'll see that I have another set of XML and STA servers that I want to make sure are properly configured. Otherwise, they're going to cause issues launching applications. Now, the other thing I want to point your attention to is if you go back here, if session reliability is enabled on the Citrix XenApp farm within the policies, and you don't have it enabled here, then you're going to cause issues. So make sure if you're using session reliability, that you're using session reliability all the way through by making sure it's enabled here as well. Otherwise, don't use it. And that way you don't, get away from the headache, so to speak. So the other thing that I wanted to show you here is if we get out of the web interface management, and let's go ahead and launch Server Manager here. Take a look at some of my services. You have a bunch of Citrix services that are running. So just make sure that all the Citrix services that are necessary here are properly configured and properly running. One of the important ones is MFCOM service. Make sure that's running. Your independent management architecture, that one should be running. Your XTE service here, if you're using session reliability, this service will start automatically. If you're not using session reliability, this service will not start. Now, if you're using session reliability and this service hasn't started, it might cause the IMA to not start properly. So make sure you take a look at that as well and take a look at is it starting or is it not starting properly. If you have the Secure Gateway installed on a server, make sure the Secure Gateway services are also starting. The Citrix Print Manager service, make sure this is starting in conjunction with the Citrix Windows Print Spooler as well, in order to make sure that all of your printing is properly configured and working properly. Now let me show you on the license server which services you need to pay attention to. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to my license server real quick. Let's go ahead and launch the Server Manager on this server as well. And let's drill down under configuration here. And let's click on services. Again, they're very easy to spot, very easy to find. So you just want to make sure that your Citrix license server and the license support services, those are all running. You want to make sure those are all running. The WMI, you'll notice that it's manual, so it doesn't necessarily have to be running. But the two that are important is Citrix licensing and Citrix licensing support services. Those should be properly configured and running in order for the licensing server to properly deliver the licenses to the farm and to the XenApp servers. That's all there is really to it from a troubleshooting perspective. What I'm going to do now is switch back to the presentation so that we can continue with troubleshooting some of the printing issues. Printing issues. Don't we all love printing issues? Printing issues, I get a shiver when I hear printing issues. Alright, so with printing, it's come a long way. The first thing I want you to check with printing is the print spooler running. Is the Citrix Print Management service running? Those two are interdependent, and more often than not, they could be the cause of why your users aren't able to print. So make sure those two are printing properly, they're started properly, etc., etc. Are you using auto-created client printers locally? And in that case, if you make sure the job is routing properly. Are you using locally attached printers so the print job has to travel all the way to the local printer or local computer device and then spool to the printer? And in that case, is that causing the problem? Take a look at that. Take a look at that very, very explicitly. Are all the print drivers installed and properly replicated to all the XenApp servers in the environment? Because you're getting calls that users are, getting their printers sometimes, they're not getting their printers other times. Well, as soon as you hear that, just double check that all the printers drivers are properly installed and replicated to all the XenApp servers. Are you using the universal print driver or are you using the native print driver? How do you have that policy configured? Do you have it configured so that you're always using the native print driver, you're always using universal print driver, or are you using native print driver, and if that's not available, use universal, or vice versa? Check that as well. That's very, very important. Are logon times long? And if so, do you have your applications configured to wait for the printers to be created before they give the users access to the session? If so, you might want to consider changing that so that the user immediately gets access to the desktop or the published application or resource while the printers are being created in the background. Are you seeing slow published application launches? If so, can you reduce the number of print drivers that are available and maybe just map the client's default printer so that not all the printers that are available locally are being mapped? Can you get away from mapping the native print drivers and maybe just mapping the universal print driver? Do your users need all the fancy features that the print driver has to offer, the native print driver has to offer? If not, if all they're looking for is just printing, can we get away with just the universal printer driver? Are you capping the print bandwidth? If people are complaining that printing is slow, do you have printer bandwidth configured so that they're only getting maybe less than what they need to get, and as a result printing is slow? You should also take a look at that. That's also important, and make sure you're not doing it the wrong way. So all of these factors can contribute to printing issues. Whenever we're dealing with troubleshooting, I have some favorite supporting resources. I would definitely suggest you check the knowledge base. The articles that you get on the knowledge base, very helpful. Most of the time they'll lead you in the right direction. The Citrix forums are great. Post a question, I'm sure you'll get answers. Citrix product documentation is now completely online, so it's no longer have to download a PDF or anything. Check it out. Google knows. Google will find anything. It'll also crawl the Citrix knowledge base and Citrix product documentation better than what the native Citrix search engine will, so I definitely would start there for sure. All right, so what have we learned in this lesson, in this troubleshooting lesson? Well, we talked about the 7 categories of troubleshooting XenApp 6 that the prep guide has suggested. We looked at the printing issues that we could potentially have, and I gave you different things to look at and different places that you can consult in order to get some hints on where and how you can start troubleshooting. We looked at web interface and different aspects of web interface, especially the XML servers. Are all the XML servers that are configured in that list, are the services starting on them? Are they having any kind of issues? Do you need to remove maybe one of the servers in that load balancing list, maybe because it's causing issues? The auto detection of the client, I showed you where you can go to enable that and how that's sometimes missed during the installation of web interface. We took a look at the load and how you use the qfarm/load command. What are the different values and what they mean? We talked a little bit about what can affect connectivity within a Citrix farm, like name resolution and other things, making sure the telnet, you're leveraging the telnet command to figuring out if all the proper ports are open. We talked about also taking a look at the load evaluators and making sure that all your load evaluators are properly configured, especially if you have custom load evaluators that you've created within the environment. So we took a look at all of these categories, all of these classes of troubleshooting from a XenApp 6 perspective, which I'm hoping has given you a good idea, a good foundation to go start looking at these issues and give you an insight on where to start looking for these issues if and when they occur within your environment. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.